Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to be with you today or yesterday. I have been listening to today. And I'd just like to say a big word of thanks to Moritz for putting together what has been an excellent set of discussions, and in particular also to Richard Vague for his strong support for the work that INET has been doing in the area of debt. So we've been asked in this concluding session to talk about how much debt is too much, how much leverage is too much. And I thought it would be useful to think about three different aspects of that. The first of which is leverage within the financial system itself and financial instability. The second is leverage within the real economy, whether the issue we've just been discussing right now with Emil's paper, can we have too much GDP in the real economy? And thirdly, whether we need also to focus on some exceptional circumstances where I think there's maybe only been two in economic history, where we simply end up with such a high level of leverage across the world that it simply never goes away, and where we really have to think more deeply about the macroeconomics of that situation. I think it's useful to think about these things separately because it helps us to define where economics, I think, has clearly addressed the issues and we have some good understandings, and where there are some unresolved issues or interesting policy questions. First, on leverage within the financial system as itself. As I mentioned earlier in my question to Oscar, that was a very, very major focus of the financial regulators and the central bankers after 2008. There was actually a division of emphasis, I think, within us, those of us who were involved at that time, between those of us who were very interested in the macro consequences and those who only wanted to focus on the financial system itself. But certainly in terms of the fundamental theory which lay behind the re-regulation of the financial system, it was primarily driven by a fairly narrowly defined issue of financial instability rather than by the macroeconomic consequences of too much debt. And the regulations that we were introduced were based on the belief that if we reduce the leverage of banks, if we increase their risk-rated ratios, but also reduce their maturity transformation, we would make the financial system itself safer, less likely to produce a crisis, and in particular, less likely to produce a bankruptcy or the threatened bankruptcy of banks and the need for fiscal support. And that's why we drove the very significant increases in capital ratios which were introduced. It's important to realize just how much capital ratios, or at least required capital ratios, and in particular for the major systemic banks of the world, were increased after 2008, because the combined effect was a redefinition of what counts as equity in the numerator, a considerable tightening up on the way that we weight risk assets in the denominator, particularly in trading books, and thirdly, increases in the required ratios. And when you put those three together, I think the required level of capital of the banking system, certainly of the major systemically important banks, went up by about 3 or 4 times, and probably average capital ratios, effective capital ratios, have gone up twice. And as I was looking at Oscar's work earlier, I wondered whether the pattern which he showed of a relatively flat level of capital leverage over the post-Second World War period captured just how significantly capital ratios have gone up. So my belief is we have very significantly increased those capital ratios. I think the question is, has it made the financial system itself more stable? Oscar raised some interesting questions about that, but I have to say my own feeling, and that reflects the discussion which we had right at the beginning of this morning, is that yes, we have, that the financial system in itself is less likely to be, at least for now and at least until we forget the last crisis and allow things to weaken again, as we undoubtedly will at some time. Right at the moment, I think it is more robust. I think we are less likely than in 2007 and 8 to see the failure or the close to failure of major systemically important banks. So I think there's a body of thought about that. I think we have some very good insights into it now. They never give us the definitive answer of what should be bank leverage. I was always a hawk on that. I continue to be a hawk. I think we should have done even more. I would run banks with capital ratios of about 15 to 20%, but I don't know what the science to get that is. So have we got too much debt within the financial system itself, within its leverage? Probably still a bit too much, but we're in a much better situation than we were in 2008. But, and this is my second point, I think that defining the problem out of 2008 in terms of the stability of the financial system itself and the probability of failure of large banks is far too narrow a definition, and the costs of fiscal support to recapitalize the banks were, in retrospect, the small change of the harm that was done. The harm that was done was by the process of over-leverage and then those post-crisis forms of adjustment, which Emil just talked about. So the important issue, and I think the even more important issue than the financial stability within the system itself, is what can we say about leverage within the real economy, about the total debt to non-financial corporates and households as a percent of GDP. Can that be too high? Can it grow too fast? Can it be too concentrated in particular sectors? And I think there's a variety of papers that we've seen today, and I think yesterday as well, which I do think give us an increasingly clear understanding, is that too much a leverage increases the danger of harmful financial crisis and creates very difficult post-crisis adjustment processes, and that too much of particular sorts of debt create particular problems, in particular real estate. Though having said that, the fact that real estate is always the big problem should hardly surprise us, because the vast majority of lending in modern banking systems is real estate. And Oscar reminded us of that in the chart drawn from the paper that he and Alan and Moritz did on the great mortgaging. And he showed us that all the expansion, pretty much all the expansion of leverage over the last 15 years had been in the residential area and essentially in the mortgage area. There'd been a small increase in corporate, but actually even within corporate, if you dive into it, in most markets, there has been an increasing percentage which corporate lending is essentially real estate lending. It's either lending for the construction of real estate, or it is lending for the overt investment in real estate, or it is lending to real estate, somewhat real estate-based companies like restaurant chains or hotels, where the bankers take a key element of reassurance from the fact that they are secured against real estate. And at least in the UK and in other figures I've seen, I think we really have to think about our banking systems as being 75 or 80% focused on lending against real estate. And if that's the case, it shouldn't at all surprise us that, as Claudio Borio has illustrated in his work at the BIS, pretty much all financial crises have at their core real estate lending. So I think we know that we can have too much real economy leverage, and in particular, too much real estate leverage. But how much is too much? Can we come up with the magic figure? You know, it's 120%, that's it. And the challenge there, and this is what Emil's paper and Holger's response was just dealing with, is how do we then balance the harmful impacts of too much leverage or too much leverage in particular sectors versus whatever benefits there might be from debt? And it's here that I actually think that much of the literature is still strangely inadequate. Because as Emil said, and I think was implied within Holger's comments as well, most of the literature on the beneficial impact of debt is disconnected from what most debt is in modern economies. Most of the literature is about a financial deepening in debt contracts which fund capital investment. Again and again in the literature, in Ross Ravine's work, in Rajan and Zingale's Saving Capitalism for the Capitalists, in most articles, papers, even after the very good work of Oscar, Moritz, and Alan have told us what lending is, most of it talks again and again of the banking system lending money to finance projects, to finance investments. But as the empirical work says, the vast majority of lending of the banking system today is not funding capital investments. Now, it may be doing something which is beneficial. It may be that a large amount of lending to finance the purchase of assets that already exist, residential housing assets, may lubricate a distribution of housing assets between individuals, which has some welfare maximizing effect. But even if that is the case, it has nothing to do with the efficiency of the capital allocation process on which most of the analysis focuses. It is also true, and Richard has reminded us, is that there is another theory of the funding, the role of debt, which is not simply about the enforceability of contracts, the ineffectiveness of equity markets, which is the classic financial deepening Ross Levine theory. There's a theory that goes back to Hayek, which is that lending by banks can achieve what Hayek called forced savings. It can achieve a higher level of aggregate investment in the economy than individual savers would, in an entirely equity system, would ever chosen to have themselves. And I think that is absolutely the description of what happened through bank lending to fund investment in Japan in the 1950s and 60s, and Korea in the 1960s and 70s, and has occurred in China in the last 30 years. But even when you see it in those terms, rather than in a sort of enforceability of contract terms, that is, again, is focused on the funding of actual capital investment projects. And it doesn't give us a theory of how we think about consumer lending, lending to people so that they can consume before they have income, mortgage lending, lubricating the supply, the allocation of already existing assets, or lending to private equity companies to leverage up existing cash flows. So I think we need to develop a theory of benefits versus harms, which either decides that there's very little benefit in these other categories of lending, or describes what the benefits are, but at least gives us a theory of that. What I think we will find out of that is a very strong argument for some sort of inverse U in the impact of the scale of leverage on the economy. And I think that is completely compatible with what Emil just said, but also not challenged by the evidence that Holger quoted. Whenever I've looked at the evidence of things like the Thailand versus India comparison, I think what one has to realize is it's a comparison much further down the scale of debt to GDP than where the rich developed economies are. I think it is easy to believe that with India, which as late as 1990 only had about 15% debt to GDP, and even today only has debt to GDP of 50 to 60%, that it would get beneficial financial deepening if it went to 90 or 100%, maybe. But I think that is a completely different question from whether there is any benefit from financial deepening from 100 to 170%, which is what the rich developed world did between about 1980 and 2007, with that deepening entirely explained by categories of lending which have nothing to do with capital investment. So I do think we need to break down the categories of lending, and we need to realize that these theories, either of Hayekian forced savings or of sort of a enforceability of contracts, better allocation of capital, they only relate to that aspect of a bank lending or market lending, which relates to capital investment. And that is a small element of what the financial system does below. And I think once you realize that, there's a very long argument for believing that we should expect to see a sort of inverse U in terms of the impact of leverage on real economic growth, that it is positive across some range and then negative beyond it. The third point I want to make, though, is do we need to think, and I think we do need to think, about just how exceptional are the situation in which we are now in and the situation in which we were in the 1930s, and the need to focus on the macroeconomic understanding of how you get out of these extreme debt overhang situations, and to realize, perhaps unfortunately, that when we really face these circumstances, some of our classic analytical techniques of turning on the regression analysis and the correlation analysis is not going to tell us much, because we really only have two historic data points. The point I'm making about post-2008 is this is not just another post-financial crisis like, post-Sweden in the early 1990s or the Massachusetts real estate boom of the late 1980s, etc. This is really extreme. I mean, 10 years after 2008, we are still stuck with nominal interest rates close to zero, below zero in some cases, and heading back down towards zero. We have 10-year rates, several of which are negative. I mean, German 10-year rates are now at about minus 0.35%. So are Japanese. We have real rates, which are very significantly negative throughout the world. This is a very extreme situation, and it is different from the post-crisis environment of almost any other crisis we have looked at. These rates are not just the product of quantitative easing of policy decisions, but they are, I think, the inevitable response to the sheer size of the debt overhang which was left behind in 2008, where what matters is the global debt overhang rather than the overhang in any one country. I think we have simply entered a world in which there is so much debt that we need to have interest rates at these levels to make that debt sustainable, because if interest rates return to what we used to think was normal levels, this amount of debt would clearly be unsustainable and would produce severe depression. Therefore, we keep interest rates very low, therefore new debt gets created. And it seems to me that we need to really focus on our macroeconomic theory of what happens when you are in that situation. And that unfortunately, although much of the analysis today can throw light on less severe financial crises by drawing attention to patterns from the past data, the challenge here is that I only think we've faced this once before in the last 150 years on this scale. And that is after the huge debt buildup of the 1920s and the bust of the 1929 and thereafter. Now, we know how we eventually got out of it after 1929. We partly got out of the high level of debt, the swing down on Oscar's chart that he showed us earlier, because we had massive debt defaults and debt write-offs, which we haven't had this time round. But those massive debt defaults and debt write-offs did produce pretty catastrophic financial collapses and political consequences. But we also got out of it by World War, massive fiscal expansion, a significant amount of part of which, Friedman and Schwartz estimated 1/3 for the US, was permanently monetary financed rather than truly debt financed with issue of real debt to the non-central bank private sector. So when we had this huge debt overhang in 1929, we should remember just how extreme were the policies required to get out of it. This time round, we have not had those huge defaults. However, what we have had is very significant fiscal deficits. Essentially, I think the expansion of the fiscal deficits, both in China and the US over the last 2 years, are far bigger than many people often focus on. We've seen two major economies put in massive fiscal stimulus. We have seen in at least one country, Japan, essentially large amounts of what will turn out in retrospect to be permanent monetary finance. And we have maintained interest rates so low as to make this debt affordable, but at the expense of creating new debt. So the mix so far has not yet produced, as it were, the return to normality, which as it were, in the mid-20th century, we might got to back by the 1950s. So I guess the question I'm putting forward is, do we have to recognize not just the impact of too much debt in the financial system itself and leverage issues there? Do we not have, problem number one. Problem number two, the issue of how much debt is too much, and do we understand why financial crises occur and the scale of the post-financial crisis debt deflation pressures? But do we also have to focus on an extreme version of it, which I'm suggesting we've really only faced once before, where the level of debt that we got to was just so big that we enter a macroeconomic situation where there is no way out except with very large permanent fiscal deficits, large permanent monetizations, or running interest rates at close to zero, not just for 10 years, but maybe for another 10 years, because I think we need to recognize that we're a long way out of this yet. But my key point is, I think that we have a very, very rich set of understanding here, but there are some extra areas which I think could deserve still deeper analysis. Thank you very much.